The topic today is the rise of authoritarianism and the working class response. And our speakers, our first speaker will be Yasin Kaya, who is a leading member of Socialist Action. The son of a coal miner, he became politically active in Turkey and studied political economy at York University. Yasin is a steering committee member of the NDP Socialist Caucus as well. Our second speaker, Comrade Lisa Luinenberg, yeah, you got it. Is a member of the national leadership of Socialist Action USA. For years, she has worked diligently in the movement for the rights of migrant and immigrant workers in her home city of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Lisa is a co-author of the current essay, U.S. Resolution on Women's Liberation. And our third speaker is David Pigeon, and I'm sure you'll come on and pronounce it quite differently. And he's a leader of the new anti-capitalist party in France, and hopefully we will get him set up on Skype as the third speaker. Each speaker has up to 15 minutes, so without further ado, Comrade Yasin.
Thank you very much. How are you, comrades in France? Good? Very good. I'm good to be here. As Elizabeth said, I migrated from Turkey 9 years ago. And one of the things that I learned in this country, Canada, is make your important points first. Because you never know, maybe a lightning can strike you or a thunder can stop you.
That's right.
We call Elizabeth Thunder. I will try to set the stage for the further discussion, hence my presentation will be a bit more in general level. And I will make 3 points today. The first of all, the rise of authoritarianism that we see around the world today is linked to capitalist crisis. In fact, it's a product of the ongoing capitalist crisis and the decay of capitalism. And what Rosa Luxemburg once said, socialism or barbarism, that statement is very true today. The humanity is facing this two paths, either socialism or barbarism. The second point I will make is authoritarianism takes multiple forms. Fascism is different than nationalist authoritarian movements that are taking place in Brazil, in Turkey today. So we have to differentiate different types of authoritarianism so that our responses, working class responses, can be adjusted accordingly. Both are bad. Fascism is bad, so is nationalist authoritarianism, but the responses should be different. They should be adjusted according to the problems that we're facing. And thirdly, since the terminal crisis of capitalism struck the world in 2008, capitalism still the crisis is still with us, despite the fact that the workers and people around the world are fighting back. In the media, there's a sense of pessimism being disseminated, but we should not forget that since 2009 at least, the world is shaken by a series of revolts. Hence, the capitalist class is responding to those working class revolts with an increased level of authoritarianism, and that will be my third point today. And my plan today is to start with a snapshot of the authoritarianism in the world and here in Ontario. Secondly, I will give a snapshot of capitalist crisis in the world, and in particular Turkey, because I'm from Turkey and this is the context that I know the most. And I will finish with an account of the list of popular revolts, and again I will focus on Turkey. Without further ado, let's get started with what is happening. We see three waves or three strands of rising authoritarianism. The first one is the rise of national authoritarianism that is taking place in Poland, Hungary, definitely in Turkey, and now in Brazil. So these are more like from top to bottom type of authoritarianism led by authoritarian leaders. That's key because unlike in fascist regimes, we don't see a very strong petit bourgeois support on the ground. We do not see gangs taking over or dominating the working or trying to stop the working class movement in grassroots level. So these national authoritarian regimes have that crucial difference. I'm not saying that there are no seeds of fascism. There are some undercurrents of fascism, and there might be some fascist organizations in these social formations in these countries. but the dominant form of authoritarianism is distinct from what we saw in Italy and in Germany in the 1930s. And that's the first wave, the first type. And secondly, we see the rise of eccentric authoritarian figures, the angry white guys with bad hair, like Trump and Ford here in Ontario. And Lisa will talk more about Trump, and we can talk about, yesterday there was a discussion on the municipal elections and Ford, obviously. That will not be my focus, but I will talk about that too. And lastly, we see the radical right movements rising in countries such as Italy and Germany. In Germany, excuse my German, Alternative für Deutschland, the radical right movement, and Lega in Italy, and in Greece we saw Golden Dawn, and here in Toronto even we have some supporters of Golden Dawn still. So that's the third way of authoritarianism. Let's start with Ontario very, very, very quickly. Obviously, Ford, the premier, is demonstrating an unprecedented level of authoritarianism in this province, and he did intervene in the municipal elections directly. And in the municipal elections that we had on October 22nd, the turnout was very low, 41%. And that was 20% lower than the previous municipal elections. Why? Well, first of all, because people were confused. Ford tried to change the municipal election regime or the structure. And secondly, people did not see a real alternative on the ground. And as, around the world, as a kind of a general rule, we know that when people don't see a real alternative, real opposition, they do not go to the polls. So that also explains the low turnout. But we as socialists always try to see social phenomena in dialectical form. So if there is a rising authoritarianism, we should be also seeing the, maybe not dominant, but definitely existing oppositionary currents. And obviously on the one hand we had fascists, white supremacists, not fascists, maybe white supremacists, Faith Goldie coming third, but the fourth candidate in the municipal election was someone we supported, Seron Gebre-Selassie, a leftist lawyer. She got 2%, but still important to notice that, because such seeds of opposition can become dominant in the future. Of course, our candidate, Peter de Gama for Ward 1, he received a small vote, but the platform that he ran on had some, and I see Peter coming in the room now. Speaking of Peter, he got a small vote, but he ran on a very socialist program, very progressive program, and his ideas, our ideas, were disseminated throughout the city with some support. So let's move to so this is a snapshot of rising authoritarianism in the world and in our local context now. And let me try to make the connection with the capitalist crisis. First of all, the Trump administration started, when they started, they were responding, their political line was responding to an increasing crisis of capitalism, economic crisis. People look at the financial sector to understand the health of the economic sector. Sometimes they look at the growth rates, so on and so forth. I think one of the best measures to understand the health of an industrialized economy is the investment rate, real investment rate that is adjusted for inflation. Because with the real investment rate tells you about the prospects of the capitalists. If they believe that the economy will be healthy in the future, they will invest because they're risk averse otherwise. So if you look at real investment rates, you will see the capitalists' intention to take risks, and henceforth more investment means a sustained growth in the capitalist system. And that rate was in decline, did not recover since 2008 crisis. Let me try to give you a couple of numbers. So the rate of government investment, government expenditure on investment was merely 12%, and that was the level as in 2003. So that government expenditure on investment was on the levels of 2003 in 2015. So in the 12 years, it did not increase significantly. It was still dismal. And the general investment increase from 2007 was about 5.5%. So the investment rate was not increasing. I don't want to go into the details of the economic analysis, but the American economy was in a very bad shape when Trump came to power. I think that it's safe to assume at least, or at least hypothesize, let's open the discussion, the fact that Trump administration coming to power was a response to, a particular response to increasing economic crisis in the United States. And let's try to put the 2009 crisis into a global perspective. It started in finance sector, then it spread into the investment, the sort of real economy, and we saw the layouts and everything like that. The industrial plants were not working anymore. The real sector got affected. That trend echoed in Europe in the form of a debt crisis. Governments, first of all, the capitalists in Europe could not recycle their debt because they were highly indebted, and due to the collapse of the finance sector in the United States, they went into solvency. And as a response, the governments rescued the banks in Europe. That created a government debt crisis. The private sector's crisis was transformed into a government debt crisis. And then, to reduce their debts, they started austerity measures. And we know the rest of the story. There was a huge wave of strikes and protests in Europe. People said, no, we don't want austerity measures. And then the class warfare was in place. What about the so-called developing countries? How did they change? How did the economy change as a response? First of all, United States of America tried to, overcome the crisis by printing more money. You remember quantitative easing and stuff like that, because it's very easy for the United States to print money because they call the shots. That money, new money generated, found its way in the developing countries such as Turkey, India, Brazil, so on and so forth. In these countries, money to burn, cash is flowing into their country. And that money, as a response, it was challenging to finance sector, but especially construction sector, consumption, individual consumption increased in these countries. But 2 years ago, the United States reversed its policies, and they cut that flow of money into these countries, right? So there wasn't enough cash to burn in these developing countries. Hence, they went into big problems in their economic system. That was the case in Turkey, India, now Brazil too. The reason of their economic slowdown is due to that amount, the money being withdrawn from the system. So what's the point here? So what I'm trying to say is the capitalist crisis that hit the world in 2008 is still there, but it has taken different forms. It was a financial crisis, transformed into a government debt crisis in Europe, and now in the third world, in the developing countries, it is taking a form of capital outflow from the system, has economic crisis. And capitalists, in the times of crisis, ask the states to step in, which increase their authoritarian measures. In other words, the increased authoritarianism is a response to economic insolvencies and economic crisis in the world. What about the working class fight back? Well, it's easy to forget nowadays. We're living in an age of forgetting. I came to this country in 2009, just after the crisis. Actually, the crisis was still unfolding. In 2011, look what happened in my last 9 years in Canada. First, there was the Arab Spring started in Tunisia, which was a working class movement supported by the major labor union federation in Tunisia. It was a working class revolt. Then it spread to Egypt, and then this whole region went into an age of revolt. Obviously, in the absence of a strong working class leadership there, these revolts went into a direction that we do not appreciate, but still the revolts were a response to capital. They were taking place in a context where marked by the decay of capitalism. And then afterwards we saw the rise of the Occupy movement, and in Europe we saw the anti-austerity movement, specifically in Greece, in Spain, and in England even. And here in Canada we saw different forms of revolts in Quebec. So we see definitely a correlation between the capitalist decay and the working class fight back. But what was the problem? Why did these movements did not lead us into a socialist world or in Rosa Luxemburg's word, socialism? Why do we still have the risk of barbarism? Why don't these working class or people's movement do not go into that direction of socialism? Rather, we have that problem of barbarism. I would say at least there are two things. First of all these movements were marked by the absence of a revolutionary leadership or revolutionary party. In order to make those revolts solidify in real gains, you need a very organized party that is supported by the knowledge of the past struggles, and which has the cadre to make the critical decisions. That element was missing in these revolts. And secondly, in the absence of that, people who went to the streets chose the parliamentary way. They tried to find response in the bourgeois parties. They wanted to find social democratic alternatives. Greece is an example of that. In Turkey, people supported the Republican Workers, RPP, Republican People's Party, which is a left-wing bourgeois party. And that didn't end well because the authoritarian Erdogan regime in Turkey, for example, just finished them all. And so in addition to the absence of Revolutionary Workers' Party in this context, we had the problem of a parliamentary way becoming the dominant solution for the people. What about the labor movement? And that's the last point that I will make.
Do you have time?
I have time?
Yeah.
But what about the response?
I'm sorry, because I thought it was 15 minutes, but you each have 20 minutes because I need 3 speakers.
Oh, okay, then I can slow down. I'll have some coffee. All right. So what about the labor movement? Capitalist crisis, rising authoritarianism as a response to capitalist crisis, plus the class warfare waged by the people. And what about the labor unions? A very critical element in our society here in Canada. What's the problem with that? We see a diminishing union democracy. Alongside of the rising authoritarianism, we see the union democracy being diminished in the major unions here in Canada. Why? First of all, in terms of ideological stances of the bureaucrats in the labor movement, we see that rather than socialist-minded leaders, we see pro-capitalist bureaucrats dominating the unions. That's the leadership problem. And secondly, when the bosses push harder, faced with declining capitalist profitability, there's less. There's this pressure on the bosses. Their profits are declining, and they push harder. And the union brass make concessions because they lack confidence in their membership. I mean, go to a random union meeting where you see a bureaucrat. They would say, if you make a socialist point there, they would say, but the membership is not ready for it. You're going too fast. You're going too fast. We have to knock on the doors. We have to try to, take our time. We have to convince them. I mean, if you say them, okay, why? It's the time for a general strike. Why don't you call for it? Oh no, the people are not ready for it. The membership is not ready for it. That's a very common thread in our society, in our unions. And unfortunately, labor unions in Canada is marked by that lack of trust to their membership. And secondly, they are afraid of losing control of the membership. That's a common element in the labor unions too, because revolution is risky. When you empower people, members, they may end up not listening to you. That's what happens in the social movements. And labor bureaucrats are afraid of losing control of their membership, hence asking or demanding or initiating a general strike, for example, is is risky for them, and they're stepping behind. They're not asking for that. And when they do mobilize the ranks, sometimes it is unavoidable. They do that to let off the steam. And that's another character of labor bureaucrats. They do not engage in labor movement or social movement to have long-term gains or to go to the very end, which should be socialism, but rather they're trying to let off the steam. So let's sum up that. So capitalism is experiencing an organic crisis. It is experienced a toxic decay.
1 minute.
All around the world, including the center of the imperialist world, including in the imperialist countries such as Canada. And we see the increasing authoritarianism alongside with increased climate change, catastrophic climate change, inequality, racism, so on and so forth. And the world still needs a World Party of Socialist Revolution, an international organization of the vanguard that can organize these revolts all around the world. The revolts will continue as long as capitalism cannot satisfy the needs of the people. It's natural. It's a kind of a law of nature. But the needed element there is an organized party which has ties internationally that can lead these revolts. And history teaches us three things, and I will end with this. First of all, nothing is permanent except change. Things keep changing. Things keep changing, and we should never be pessimistic. I mean, when we watch the news, it is clear that all those authoritarian leaders are dominating the world now. But you know, the world will not be static. Just remember the fall of the Berlin Wall. After the Berlin Wall, the main ideology said, "Oh, it's the end of the history now, Fukuyama. Now there is nothing but progress. All the conflicts are resolved." What happened after the Berlin Wall? We had nothing but more walls around us, right? More crisis, and the contradictions are there. So nothing is permanent except change. Big changes can happen very fast, sometimes quite suddenly, as in the Arab revolts in that region. So we have to get ready now. It would be too late to organize the revolutionary vanguard when the time comes. So it is today we should get ready for the future. And thirdly, there are two choices, as Rosa Luxemburg said: socialism or barbarism. Either we should prepare to make the history or be victims of it. Thank you.
Okay, Lisa, you have up to 20 minutes, dear.
All right. Since Trump took office as President of the United States in January of 2017, we have seen a rise in authoritarian rhetoric, reactionary politics, and xenophobic attacks meant to drive a wedge between certain layers of the working class. This growing polarization within the working class was demonstrated in the recent midterm elections, which took place across the U.S. on November 6th. Much of the election was essentially meant to be a referendum on Trump. In the weeks leading up to the election, Trump traveled the country to build support for Republican candidates. "Pretend I'm on the ballot," he told supporters at a recent rally in Mississippi. And indeed, the main issue that the Democrats ran on was Stop Trump, urging many of those on the left to vote for lesser evil candidates. Yet despite the projections for a blue wave of Democratic wins across the nation, the Democrats delivered a lackluster response at best. Democratic candidates for office ran the gamut from reactionary candidates like Alyssa Slotkin, a former CIA operative in Iraq, who won a congressional seat in Michigan, to the new DSA celebrity figure, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was just elected on the Democratic ticket in New York. Yet while the Democrats did manage to win a majority in the House for the first time since 2011, the Republicans increased their edge in the Senate and won several key governor races. We have in general seen a recent rightward drift among a segment of the Republican Party that follows Trump. And the Republicans held on to their traditional strongholds in rural districts and in areas of discontented white workers who voted for Trump in 2016. On the other hand, the Democrats also held on to their stronghold in urban areas, and it is significant to note that this election cycle saw more women, immigrants, and people of color elected than ever before. The election had the highest voting turnout since 1966, with about 40% of registered voters participating in the election. However, it is significant to note that over 50% of the U.S. population doesn't vote at all. That includes both working people who feel dissatisfied by the status quo offered by both capitalist parties, along with people who are disenfranchised from voting, either by racist voting laws, being convicted of a felony, or because of their immigration status. Interestingly, a referendum in Florida did pass which will allow felons to vote, providing an interesting glimpse into a positive vote along class lines. Nonetheless, while some workers and middle-class people have been hoodwinked by the anti-immigrant and racist rhetoric of the right wing, there's no doubt that the reactionary pronouncements and policies of the Trump administration over the last 2 years have had an electric effect in mobilizing people in opposition. The last 2 years have seen massive rallies across the U.S. against Trump's policies. As stated in a recent article on the elections printed in SA News, unfortunately at the present time, working people have no authentic voice in the political arena except in the streets. Some socialists mistakenly adhere to the idea that it might be possible to change the pro-big business nature of the Democratic Party by working within it, or that it might be possible to break a left wing out of the party. But both scenarios are merely wishful thinking. Similarly, it is a deadly illusion to think that revolutionary socialists can be elected to public office and work for significant social change when using the ballot line of the capitalist Democratic Party, always a lesser evil trap for the unwary. History has repeatedly demonstrated that the former party of the Klan, white citizen councils, and Southern slaveocracy serves the ruling class elite unfailingly. That this graveyard of all fighting social movements can be considered a vehicle for advancing working class interests is preposterous. In general, when progressive or left candidates run as Democrats, the party hierarchy forces them to align their positions with those of the mainstream, not the opposite. In this context, it is extremely important to remember that it is the capitalist system, not Trump, that is the ultimate oppressor of the working class. No matter which wing of the ruling class takes power in a given election, the assault on working people will remain the same. Nevertheless, we've seen a move to the right since Trump took power. Let's take a closer look at some of the reactionary ideas and policies that have taken root in the U.S. over the past 2 years. It is indisputable that since Trump was elected, there has been an uptick in hate crimes and violence against people of color.
I'm not going to try that again.
All right.
Trying to get, because some people want it louder. So if you want to stop for, sorry sister, but if you want to stop for a second just to get the mic set up. Sure. Maybe it was my mic that
I think it was a little loud maybe on your end.
Turn your mic off, Elizabeth.
Just a
Turn your mic off.
Pardon me?
You should turn your mic off.
Turn your mic off.
No, you can't
Turn it off.
You can't turn it off.
You can't turn it off.
Oh.
These games are
But we've used it yesterday here, without
just. I don't know why it's so loud.
Or whoever can't hear it can sit closer.
Was elected, there has been an uptick in hate crimes and violence against people of color, Muslims, LGBTQI people, and immigrants. Trump's racist, Islamophobic, and anti-immigrant rhetoric has fueled this wave of hate. The U.S. has seen a recent wave of violence, mostly aimed against people of color and other minorities. This includes an attack by Gregory Allen Bush, a white gunman who executed 2 African Americans in a grocery store parking lot in Kentucky on October 24th. The nation was recently gripped by another tragedy when Robert Bowers killed 11 people and wounded 6 others during an attack on Pittsburgh's Tree of Life synagogue. Although Bowers was not a Trump supporter, he had posted hateful anti-Semitic statements on social media in recent weeks saying that Trump was too soft on Jews. And while Bush, Bowers, and others do not appear to be part of a coordinated effort of organized hate groups, it is clear that they have been emboldened by the president's rhetoric.
Just forget it.
Should I forget it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Try and talk louder. While we reject the idea that Trump represents a rising fascism, it is clear that the far right, including fascist-minded elements, have been energized by his immigrant bashing, Islamophobia, and racism. Although the right often celebrates such figures as heroes and lone wolf actors, activists should not discount the effect of their actions. The terror they foster is real. Recent Proud Boy attacks in New York City and Portland are additional examples of the violent propensities of the far right. In New York, on October 11, Proud Boys attacked people who were protesting their participation in a meeting of a local Republican Party club. Cops looked the other way while the Proud Boys screamed obscenities at the protesters, then arrested 3 of the anti-fascist demonstrators. And in Portland, on October 13, Proud Boys joined with Patriot Prayer and other far-right groups in a flash mob for law and order to counter a memorial gathering for police shooting victim Patrick Kimmons. Police said that people carried knives, hard-knuckle gloves, and firearms into the melee that followed. Everyone who supports civil liberties must repudiate the recent violence and bigoted rhetoric by the far right. Workers and the oppressed cannot rely on the capitalist police, courts, or politicians for protection. Workers and the oppressed must assert their right to organize self-defense through the construction of defense guards based on mass organizations. This is not a fight that will be won by small groups of isolated fighters. What is needed is a broad and united movement of unions, immigrant organizations, Black and brown organizations, and the women's and LGBTQI movements, which can stop the ultra-right in its tracks. On October 21, the New York Times reported that the Trump administration is considering narrowly defining gender as a biological immutable condition determined by genitalia at birth, the most drastic move yet in a government effort to roll back recognition and protections of transgender people under federal civil rights law. This announcement is one in a long line of attempts to take away trans, non-binary, and intersex people's democratic rights. The Trump administration has already attempted to ban transgender people from serving in the military, has rescinded the Obama-era guidelines on transgender access to school restrooms and homeless shelters, and has imposed new policies for the Bureau of Prisons to make biological sex the initial determinant for placement in prisons. In a disturbing move, the Trump administration has removed mention of gender from the Department of Health and Human Services guidelines on sex discrimination, and has also lobbied the UN to remove gender from human rights documentation. The repercussions of a new and more rigid official government definition of gender could be far-ranging. It could lead to even more intense struggles over access to bathrooms, appropriate health care, and legal protections at work for trans people. Furthermore, the administration's sanctioning of anti-transgender bigotry will lead to a wider acceptance of discrimination and abuse, far beyond the reading of the law. Unsurprisingly, the members of the working class who do not fit neatly into ideal and abstract gender categories face a great deal of difficulties. Workplace discrimination based on gender identity or sexual orientation is not explicitly prohibited in U.S. federal law or in most states. Transgender people are more likely to face employment discrimination, poverty, housing discrimination, homelessness, and police violence, and are disproportionately victims of homicide, especially trans women of color. And trans people are, rather astonishingly, 25 times more likely to have attempted suicide. In a similar vein, outrage was widespread throughout the United States over President Trump's recent nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh has been roundly criticized for his reactionary rulings against labor and protections for the environment, and scorned for his opinions and actions that denigrate women. Despite massive protests against Kavanaugh that began right after his nomination was announced on July 9, he was ultimately confirmed by a vote of 50 to 48 in the Senate. There is little doubt that he will move the court further to the right and drive its rulings to greater extremes. The looming anger that Roe v. Wade could be overturned initially energized women across the country to oppose his confirmation. Polls showed that Kavanaugh was the most unpopular Supreme Court nominee in history. And then on September 16, a bombshell fell when Christine Blasey Ford said that Brett Kavanaugh had sexually assaulted her when she was 15 and he was 17. Protest rallies took place in all 50 states, as well as civil disobedience in the halls of the Senate office building. This created pressure on the Senate Judiciary Committee to allow Dr. Ford to be able to testify. As a result of the Me Too movement, women have become empowered to tell their story and also listen to others. One woman told CNN, "I knew that if I watched Christine Ford testify, it would trigger my own trauma, but I was determined to watch." The nation was riveted by her testimony. Wherever you went, her wrenching and authentic testimony was being heard on the radio, television, or phone. The Capitol Police reported arresting 200 women protesting the Cavanaugh hearings. Most of the signs said simply, "I believe her." One woman told a reporter, "This wasn't really organized. I've never done this before, but people need to see our faces." Street protests against Cavanaugh have involved thousands of women and men who have real fears of his reactionary agenda and who don't want a sexual predator on the Supreme Court. But Trump has ignored the grassroots nature of these protests and instead has regularly denounced the opposition to Kavanaugh's appointment as originating within the Democratic Party. He told the crowd at a rally in Johnson City, Tennessee, "The Democrats only know how to obstruct, demolish, and destroy, as we've seen in recent weeks. Democrats are willing to do anything and hurt anyone to get their way, like they're doing with Judge Kavanaugh." The mass protests in the street against Kavanaugh's nomination were one sign of a growing women's movement across the United States. It is clear that women and their allies are still concerned about issues from sexual violence to access to abortions and family planning services, and are willing to come out in the thousands to make their voices heard when the stakes are high. Immigration has been one of the most polarizing hot-button issues in the United States for years. While Obama became known as the deporter-in-chief for removing more immigrants than all previous U.S. presidents combined, Trump has taken the debate over immigration to a whole new level. Since the beginning of his presidential campaign, Trump has used extremely xenophobic language, scapegoating immigrants from Mexico and Central America. Over the past 2 years that he has been president, Trump has attempted to bully Congress into enacting ever more draconian measures targeting undocumented immigrants residing in the U.S. He has threatened to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. He has threatened to beef up the Border Patrol and other security measures at the U.S.-Mexico border. He has threatened to renegotiate the NAFTA trade deal. Well, it's not a threat anymore, he did that. Yeah. He has called Mexican immigrants dangerous drug dealers and rapists. Earlier this year, the Trump administration announced that it would be ending the TPS, or Temporary Protective Status program, for 200,000 Salvadoran immigrants, 45,000 Haitian immigrants, and 90,000 Honduran immigrants. Other groups, such as immigrants from Nicaragua, Nepal, and Sudan, have already lost their status. In fact, due to the changes initiated by Trump, 98% of the 317,000 TPS holders in the U.S. have now lost their protective status. The TPS program was created in 1990 to provide legal protections for immigrants coming from countries devastated by natural disasters like hurricanes or armed conflicts and violence. Many of the recipients of the program have now lived in the United States for decades and have built a life here. They have jobs, pay taxes, own homes, and have children who were born in the U.S. They send money to support their relatives back home, money that the economies of their countries of origin depend on. According to the New York Times, in 2016, 17% of the economy of El Salvador was built on remittances. Similarly, CNN reports that in 2017, remittances made up 19% of the GDP of Honduras. Removing that flow of income would be devastating to those countries and the people who live there. The recipients whose TPS status has been terminated must now face devastating choices. Most of them are given an 18-month timeline to leave the U.S. If they choose to stay, they will lose their jobs and join the ranks of the 11 million undocumented immigrants who face deportation every day in order to put food on the table for their families. Originally quoted in the New York Times, Veronica Lagunas, a 39-year-old Salvadoran woman with 2 U.S.-born children, said that she would rather stay in the U.S. illegally, losing her job and benefits and risking deportation, rather than return to her home country. She said, "There's nothing to go back to in El Salvador. The infrastructure may be better now, but the country is in no condition to receive us." During the summer of 2018, the plight of undocumented immigrants again gripped national attention as the Trump administration began a policy of separating immigrants from their children at the border, literally ripping children from their parents' arms. Yolanda De La Cruz, an immigrant from Guatemala, was arrested when she and her 4-year-old son crossed the U.S.-Mexico border. She had tried 3 times to file for asylum without success. In mid-July, she was reunited with her son after border officials had separated them for 6 weeks. Her son had been sent to a government facility in Texas and then to a privately run one in Oklahoma, the type of incarceration that thousands of immigrant children have been subjected to. Yolanda did not speak with her son for 30 days. "He is traumatized by what happened," his mother said. "He has nightmares, wets the bed, and he tells me, 'Please don't send me back to that place.'" These heinous acts inspired thousands of people across the United States to protest the Trump administration's policies. In Minneapolis, where I live, 30,000 people protested the family separations. Ultimately, the mass protests and public attention on this issue forced the Trump administration to reunite immigrant parents with their children, although this proved easier said than done. The most recent crisis to grab the national attention has been the caravan of Central American migrants, which is now winding its way through Mexico toward the U.S.-Mexico border. The caravan is made up mostly of young people from Central America who are trying to escape the grinding poverty and gang violence in their home countries that are the result of brutal U.S. military and economic interventions, which have been perpetuated in the U.S. ruling class, by the U.S. ruling class in Central America and Latin America for centuries. While Trump's housing monopoly undoubtedly profits off the labor of undocumented workers here in the U.S., he continues to use reactionary language to describe the migrants now winding their way towards the U.S. He has shouted since day one of his presidential campaign that migrants are all criminals, rapists, gang members, coming to the U.S. to steal white people's jobs and run amok in our country. Trump has threatened to close the border to the approaching migrants and deny them the right to seek asylum, has threatened to deploy thousands of troops to the U.S.-Mexico border, which is actually done now. These troops would reinforce the roughly 2,000 National Guard troops, which have already been deployed to the border since April. He has also proposed to change the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution to deny children of undocumented immigrants born in the United States the fundamental right to citizenship. This strategy is meant to divide the working class over the questions of race and immigration. It denies the fact that migration has been taking place throughout human history and the fact that it was the United States who created the various crises in Central America and Mexico that are pushing people to flee the horrific conditions in their own countries, to seek a better life for their families. But that doesn't mean that immigrants and their allies today are taking all the attacks that Trump has leveled against them without a fight. Organizing efforts are already underway in cities across the U.S. to support the caravan and greet its arrival at the border with much-needed solidarity as well as practical support such as food, water, clothing, and medical care. While it is clear that Trump's election as U.S. president has sparked a wave of xenophobic and reactionary rhetoric and policies, it is also true that the previous 2 years have seen sporadic but at times massive protests in the street against the reactionary policies introduced by his administration. A result of this wave of controversy and protest is a burgeoning class consciousness. This in turn has opened up a new receptivity to socialism among students and young workers, a receptivity really unprecedented since the 1930s. Bernie Sanders, who ran a pro-Democratic Party socialist campaign in 2016, spoke to rallies of over 10,000 in cities across the U.S. What was significant was that he was perceived as a socialist, not as a Democrat, to his most enthusiastic supporters. Contrary to the end-of-history obituary pronounced on socialism after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, It is socialism, not capitalism, that resonates with the hundreds of thousands who responded to his campaign. That they don't know much about socialism or how to fight for it are simply symptoms of the first hesitant steps. But they do grasp with increasing clarity that capitalism is the gravedigger of the human race. As socialists, we recognize the dangers of falling into the trap of the lesser evils promoted by the Democratic Party. We also recognize that Trump, despite his heinous speeches and actions over the last 2 years, is merely one part of the capitalist system that rules over every aspect of our lives. It ultimately doesn't matter who is in power, the Democrats or the Republicans. The results will be the same, although the methods of delivery for their policies may differ. As Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. As long as the ruling class is in power, they will continue to attack women, immigrants, people of color, the environment, and LGBTQI people to extract the greatest amount of profits to line their already rich pockets. The ruling class will not be willing to give up this incredible power without a fight. As socialists, we can advance the cause for a socialist society, a more just society built around the needs of the many, not the few, by joining with the struggles of oppressed people everywhere. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains.